I wouldn't normally make a video about this, but I want to talk about Grok 3 because I think it puts an exclamation point at the end of the last era of AI and some of the lessons of that last era that we have been talking about on this channel for months now. And also it's kind of a demarcating line to say, this is what the future of AI is going to look like. This is what the second sort of wave of AI development, competition and progress is going to hold for us in this LLM boom that OpenAI started. Part of the exclamation point that Grok puts at the end of the previous era is the thing I've been talking about on this channel for months now, which is that large language models, the thing that power chatbots, the thing that powers AI, are commodities. They're nothing special. They're not an advantage, right? And I think in tracing out the story here and understanding and parsing Grok, despite its sort of blandness ultimately, it will show us 3 other lessons we can take away beyond the fact that LLMs are just commodities, and will point to an issue that OpenAI is going to face going forward in this second phase of the AI wars. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about Grok. And the reason we're talking about Grok, the sort of hook into this at all, the thing that really pushed me over the edge is that Grok is a little special. It's sort of at the top of its game. It is the best model in the world for all intents and purposes. At least it appears to be right now. That's based on a few benchmarks that people tend to use to measure these things out, that measure things like math abilities, science abilities, and coding, as well as some user perception benchmarks that we use as well in the industry. And don't get me wrong, I don't think benchmarks are everything. I was a teacher in a past life. I understand the pitfalls of standardized testing, but I think they give us a ballpark range to see where Grok falls, and it seems to fall ahead of everybody else, including ChatGPT 4.0, Gemini 2, DeepSeek R1, the whole gamut. What is incredible about that is that xAI is basically a year and a half old, a little older than that, and so they are even younger than the young players in this game, right? And they have leapfrogged everyone else in that year. And that is the piece of evidence from Grok that points to that first lesson that we've already talked about, which is that LLMs are commodities. If you can just throw a bunch of money at a problem over the course of a year and a half and just enough talent to basically leapfrog everyone else over the course of a year, you're probably not in an industry that has a big moat in one way or the other. And I would be willing to bet that, at the end of the day, this thing that you're creating is just like everybody else's. And so until there's a moment, some type of tipping point maybe, where suddenly there's like a magical line that we cross and AI becomes, these LLMs become self-sufficient and can do everything on their own, I don't think that there's anything special there. And the youth of xAI as a company and their ability to create a leading model, in this case, a frontier model, as people call it, shows us that large language models, once and for all, for the last time, are commodities. But what about Grok? What about Grok itself? How did they actually do it? How did they get there? And in order to understand that, in order to analyze Grok, I want to split up my analysis into the creation of their large language model and the use of their large language model. Partially because I think it's helpful to think of it this way, and partially because I think that this shows there's a through line between these two sides of the coin, the two different places where compute power is important, that shows us a second and maybe a third lesson that we can draw from this. So, a quick refresher. When you create a large language model, that is called pre-training. It basically is when you take all the data on the internet, you throw a bunch of NVIDIA GPUs at it, you put an algorithm in the middle, and it squishes it together into this model that can predict the next word in a series of other words. That's called pre-training. That's how you design. It's kind of like the manufacturing and design of like a processor, right? It's the creation of the model itself. On the other side of the coin, when it comes to large language models, you actually need to use them, right? You can't just create the model and have it sit there. It has to do something. Just like you can't just create a processor and have it sit there. You have to use it for something. And The use of the large language model is called inference. That's the second side of the coin, right? And I'm going to split my analysis into pre-training, the creation of the model, and inference, the use of the model. So starting with pre-training, because that has to happen first, right? There's this incredible moment early on when they're talking about Grok in their announcement video, where one of the engineers says, big intelligence comes from big clusters. And I think that's hilarious, right? I literally started laughing when I heard it. But the point of what he was saying is that, these big clusters or these enormous collections of GPUs allow you to train these models quickly, intelligently, throw more data at them, and create better versions of the models. And so on that side of the coin, we have learned the more compute power you throw at it, the more data you throw at this problem, the smarter the core model gets on its own. There was some self-reporting in that video that says that there's like the biggest cluster in the world there. I don't know that has been verified externally. They also said that they took 10 times more training for Grok 3 than they did for Grok 2. But the important part of that is that it takes a lot of compute power to do these things, and therefore the hardware matters. Now, before we nail that home, let's go to the next part, which is inference. There was this moment in early January when I made my last video where everybody was freaking out, thinking that this DeepSeek R1 model was trained more efficiently, it can be used more efficiently, and that therefore NVIDIA was going to blow up, the entire American AI industry was going to blow up, it was the end of the world. But it really wasn't, right? And I think that this shows us that NVIDIA is a continual winner even after the release of R1, because guess what? To train these models, you need the hardware. Hardware still matters. Now, flipping over to inference, we'll see that still hold, because when we used DeepSeek R1, when I tried to use DeepSeek R1 back in January, the first thing that I did was download the app, pull up the login page, and I was greeted with a message that said, hey, you can't use this thing. And that was because they said there was some sort of security thing, that they were being DDoS, that there was, some malicious activity. But that's all code for, who knows, right? That's all code for, guess what? We don't have enough hardware to accept all of these requests. And so people tend to forget, and I was frustrated back in January when people weren't talking about this. You don't just need GPUs to train these things. You need GPUs to use these things, right? And if you cannot support the amount of use of these LLMs, well, guess what? You are sort of toast in the first place. What's the point in creating them? And so DeepSeek pointed to that in January, and Grok shows us that here, which is that it seems like it's very responsive. They have a ton of GPUs. They've been using them. That's that. But it goes even further, because the way that we have constructed these chatbots has changed a lot over the last year, right? In the past, you used to have this large language model, a little bit of prompting text that says, hey, guess what? You are, gonna pretend to be an assistant, and you're gonna have this conversation with a user, right? And then a user gives it a little prompt, and it comes back, and that's that. That's the end of the story, right? Well, at the end of the day, one of the things that is interesting is that we have built on top of it since then. One of the things that we have learned is that if you give these things time to write down their thoughts, think out loud before they respond, that they actually do better, right? So whereas before, a user would give it LLM a prompt, it would come back and it would return it instantly, basically bullshitting an answer and doing a pretty convincing job, and a pretty good job of it at that. Now what we do is we put one extra step in our chatbots, which is that we give it a prompt, we let it accept that answer, and then we let it think. We let it write down a bunch of things that are hidden from the user, and then synthesize all of its own thoughts before it responds, as soon as it responds. And that is the main difference. And there's one really important fact in there, which is that the more time that we allow the model to think, in general, the better it performs on those same benchmarks that we've talked about before. And guess what? Grok 3 does this as well, right? And so in that regard, it also shows us that more compute power, more hardware means that things are better. And so that is our second lesson, which is that inference time compute is just as important as pre-training compute, and that most importantly, hardware matters because of all of that. There's one other piece here before I get into sort of our conversation about OpenAI, but I don't think that there's much more to say in particular about Grok. In fact, it's so bland to me that I think it points to one other lesson that we can draw from this, which is that not only are LLMs commodified, but I think that chatbots are too. Let me explain. If you open up OpenAI and you go to ChatGPT and you pull up DeepSeek R1 and you pull up Grok and you look at their user interfaces and you strip away all of the branding, I bet you the average person could not tell them apart and honestly would not care. Because for the most part, these things look identical. The user interface looks identical and they behave very, very similarly. In fact, one of the interesting things about Grok is that it scored very high on that score of like the user experience, user perception benchmark. I actually think that that's one of the more impressive ones, even more so than the math, science, and coding benchmarks. And I think that it shows us that these little tiny minute differences, that's like the tone of a response, are the type of thing that is going to differentiate these models and these products in the short term. And to me, that is such a small difference that it shows us that, guess what? All of these things look the same. They all sound pretty much the same. And we care so much about these like almost meaningless parts, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the importance of them, but these almost meaningless parts that really, these things have no differentiation from one another. And so looking at that, we now know that large language models are commodities. We now know that hardware is extremely important. And we now know that chatbots are also commodities at this point. Maybe you can see where I'm going with the OpenAI thing. But before I get there, I want to get to the last lesson. And I think that can be best delivered by looking at what this means for other companies, right? I did the same thing for R1 when it was released back in January. So for Google, I think that this means pretty much the same story. They, first of all, have their own proprietary LLMs, but they haven't, staked their company on having the best LLM in the world. Number two, they have tons of hardware. In fact, they have their own custom hardware for AI, and they have an entire set of talent around building these things. In fact, the transformer, the T in ChatGPT, was invented at Google. They have lots of talent, which is awesome for them, right? In fact, I was way too harsh in my last video about Google, and the more I think about it, the more Google seems very well positioned because of that. And third of all, despite all of the things that I don't like about Gemini, it doesn't look like ChatGPT, right? And they have a chat product that's like working. So that's all that matters, really, right? They also have a really important advantage, which is that they have Google search, right? That one text box that is your entry point to the rest of the internet. Now, don't get me wrong, they're under pressure from everybody else, but they haven't, I'm increasingly beginning to believe that they haven't switched that over to an even more generative chat experience because they haven't felt the need to, right? Google is their cash cow, right? It makes them a ton of money. And while they're under pressure from people like OpenAI and Perplexity and anyone else who's making a competitor search engine, at any given moment, if they feel enough pressure or if they figure out the business model, they can switch over to a chatbot in an instant at google.com and it's just there. And the lesson there is that distribution matters. I mean, you open up your phone, you open your browser, probably the first thing you're going to see is Google. And so therefore, you will have access to a Google chatbot, right? On the other hand, I think that their biggest liability is that they ship bad products. I think Gemini sucks. I think Google is getting worse right now. I think that I have a really bad perception of most of Google's things lately, other than like YouTube, honestly. And I just think that for the most part, their stuff sort of just is not very good. They have let that product mindset atrophy over time. And I think that that's a dangerous thing for them. Pixel is still kind of interesting, and Gemini has some interesting ideas, but at the end of the day, I think that they are sort of bad products. They just don't do it for me, personally. What about Meta? It's also the same story for them. They knew from the beginning that LLMs were commodities, and give Zuck credit where due, right? In fact, they knew that so much that they open sourced Llama like very early on. They were a leader in open sourcing these models, right? And that was actually a strategic advantage for them because when they open source their models, it helps it become an industry standard, makes it cheaper to run on all of their hardware, and helps them get to the point where they can use these large language models as an application, which is one of the lessons that we'll get to, right? You see, Meta wants to use these things to generate posts. They want to use them to generate ads, to make your feed even more personalized than it already is. And the cheaper it is for them to run these things, the better. They own a lot of their own hardware. They are not dependent on it. They have chatbot, but they're not dependent on that either. And the cheaper that AI gets, the better for them. And so they have a unique strategy, and that is a beneficial thing to them. And their sort of open source approach is reaffirmed by this. In fact, Grok 3, while not open source yet, has indicated that Grok 2 will get open sourced, right? That's what the Grok 3 announcement, they mentioned that Grok 2 will get open source, and that when Grok 4 comes out, Grok 3 will be open source, et cetera, all the way down the line. Which shows you that Zuck's early bet that these things are commodities was a good one. They also have distribution via their social platforms. You open up Facebook all the time, you open up Instagram all the time. Everyone in my family has some Meta app on their phone, and they will get access to Meta AI if it ever shows up and is the way that things go. So distribution is an advantage for them as well. And you can kind of see where this last lesson is, which is that distribution is really important, right? And I think the best example of this is Apple. Once again, I think Grok 3's announcement is a reaffirmation of the same story for Apple as well, but strengthens the importance of distribution, in particular, in a way that shows us how Apple has the ultimate distribution device, which is the iPhone. Hell, I have to install a Meta app on my phone. I still have to go to Google to do things. But Siri is literally a button mapped to my phone at all times that I cannot change. At any moment, Apple can upgrade Siri and have it work, right? And that's all that matters, right? And I think that, Siri is not in a good spot right now. I think that there's some interesting things that have been released over the course of the last year through Apple Intelligence. I think they've got a long way to catch up. I trust that they'll get there. I mean, again, XAI did it in a year and a half. I bet you Apple will be able to do it in a short period here as well. But the important part here is not where Apple is right now. It's the fact that they can do it relatively quickly if they have to, and that their distribution is unmatched compared to anybody else. They just have a huge advantage when it comes to building a platform for AI. So there are your 4 lessons. LLMs are commodities, hardware matters, chatbots are commodities, and distribution matters. And so what does that mean for OpenAI? They are the one company where I feel like this has totally changed things for them. For OpenAI, I feel like they are getting crunched on both sides. I mean, think about the asset that OpenAI has, ChatGPT, right? Well, what is ChatGPT fundamentally? A large language model and a chatbot. It has reasoning, but everybody else reasons. They have 4.0 and 0.1, which seem to be outperformed by Grok. They have a chatbot that looks like everybody else's in terms of its UI. And that is the core of what they offer, really. And if we're going to take these lessons at face value, they own the 2 things that Grok has shown that will be commodified here in the near term, if not have already commodified in the last several months. And so what assets does OpenAI really even have at this point if the only thing that is the core of their product is a commodity for the most part? Well, I think the first one is their brand. People think of OpenAI when they think of AI and when they think of chatbots because they were first to the table, rightfully so. A lot of people installed ChatGPT, so they have some level of distribution as well. And the second thing is that I also think that they have a product lead. This, of course, is subjective, but I think that they have a fantastic Mac app. I think it's unquestionable that they have the best desktop chat platform, right? I think that their iOS app is pretty good. I think that their web app is pretty good. I think they've got a couple of interesting ideas in their product and things like that. But a product lead is only as good as your ability to outrun everybody else. And your brand is only as good as your product. And so both of the ways in which OpenAI has advantages or leverage are beginning to erode quite quickly as everyone else catches up and throws more compute, more money at the problem. By the way, on the flip side of things, OpenAI does not own the things that we have decided are important. They don't really own hardware. They've announced a distribution advantage that OpenAI does not have the luxury of. And so at the end of the day, the important thing to remember is that products matter. And if OpenAI can sort of focus up and execute, then they have a chance. But the clock here for them is ticking. My big concern for OpenAI is that they don't have the talent anymore. They don't have an advantage in the model anymore. And that I don't know that they can run fast enough to beat everyone else. And so more than ever, I have felt like OpenAI is in an extremely precarious position, despite the amount of money that Sam Altman is able to raise for them.